Good evening.
Good evening.
It's Thursday.
It's Thursday.
And we're live from the City of London.
My name's Merlin Fulcher.
I'm Phineas Harper. Hello.
And we're bringing you some intrepid architectural journalism, socially distanced tour by bike, so you can enjoy at home. We're in the square mile. It's called a square mile because it's about a mile across on each side. In total. It's home to about 9,000 people, and on a normal working day there's 500,000 people here working in the offices and businesses. Let's roll into this amazing landscape. Okay, so we're starting out in Leadenhall Market, and if there ever was a kind of fitting tribute to the city, and the city is this sort of place of commerce and trade, it's going to be Leadenhall Market. It's a stunning building. It's a marketplace, obviously. It's kind of inspired by a similar one in Milan. Typically, it would be full of people drinking, maybe some people shopping. It was originally built as a place to sell meat. Nobody's selling meat here now. It seems like the main commodity is beer. It's super interesting because this is a kind of symbol of the City of London. You know, the fact that we trade and goods are exchanged here. If you think a lot of other councils, it's owned by the city. A lot of other councils might own a kind of depressing 1960s shopping centre. The City of London owns this magnificent, like Victorian-inspired, Horace Jones-designed landmark. It was restored in the 1990s to be the kind of grand space that you see now. I imagine it was pretty murky and dim before then. You can see there's some people drinking in the bars. Everyone's doing their best to booze it up in a responsible way to keep their favourite businesses going. But yeah, what do we see here? We see a lot of gilded surfaces. We're seeing like beautifully ornately carved details, and this big vaulted roof with stars above us. You know, it's magnificent. There's like nothing else like this. And what's really interesting when you look at it on a map, it obviously just fits in between different buildings that were once here. It kind of slots into those spaces, but you know, all those other old historic buildings that hemmed it in have all gone, and now the other buildings slot in around this. So it's come to define the city itself in these like unique tunnels and terraces. And there's one down there. Should we see what's going on down here? I'd also like to thank the patrons of Leadenhall Market for being very patient with us for making this video tonight. You know what? I feel like the real spirit of the city is very much alive. I feel like I'm possibly not dressed in the right way to be here, but I feel like if I'm a fan of beer and conversation, I'm in the right place. So architecturally, splendid, thumbs up. It's a listed building. It's the first of the listed buildings we're going to see today. We're going to move on, literally, from this mad one here to this extraordinary Grade 1 listed modernist building. This is one of the greatest items of 20th century architecture according to Historic England. It is Grade 1 listed. It's a real powerhouse of high-tech design. What do we know about this building? It's expressive. So what it does is it shows its functions on the outside, much like the Pompidou building, which is designed by Richard Rogers. Richard Rogers, the architect who designed this building, the architect who recently retired. This building has its services on the outside. And so what does that mean? It means that we can see there are ducts, huge stainless steel ducts. We can see that there are lifts. You can see the lifts moving when there are people in the lifts. You can see there are fire escape stairs. You can see there's concrete supporting structures. And you can see that there are enormous office spaces within. And if you look at a map, if you look at a satellite photo, this building is absolutely gargantuan. It is a high-tech monument, a monument to Britain in the 1980s. So it completed in 1986, although it really you know, 1986 isn't that long ago. This really looks like it's from another time. It could be from the 60s, it could be from the 70s. Obviously it was designed in the 1970s. There was a competition to design this. Ideas were put in by Norman Foster, by I.M. Pei, by Arup. This was the big mega commission. This is the building that defined British architecture of that era, of that generation, the generation of the early baby boomers, an enormously optimistic generation who thought that design, who thought that the optimism of modernism could reshape the world. Now, if I look at this building now, I can see a lot of smoked glass. I can't actually see in. I can't see what's going on in there. So despite the kind of claims to being expressive, it's a total mystery. If you look on the website, you'll find out that within this building is a banqueting hall that was recreated from an earlier Lloyds of London building. And it's on the top floor, and it's where the board members have, I presume, very swanky lunches and board meetings, sober board meetings, I hope. It also has a bell that people ring. It has a book where significant losses are signed in a quill. So there's historicist references, but none of this is really revealed on the outside, and neither is the kind of work that goes on in there. We know that Lloyds is an insurance company, that they're involved in underwriting. We also know that Lloyds recently made a public apology for some of the kind of involvement that the company had in activities relating to the slave trade in the past. So in many ways, I think the inside of Lloyds is a building I'd like to know more about. Fortunately, it has been part of the Open House Festival for many, many years, but it's not one that was able to be open this year. Now, I just want to show you one of my favourite things about the Lloyds building is the way that it integrates part of the former Lloyds building from the 1920s. So this enormous, again, monumental kind of doorway, this doorway is a remnant of what must have been a stone building, a huge stone building that was an office building, and possibly quite an old-fashioned office building with gentlemen wearing bowler hats and operating in the kind of unreconstructed model of the city. But here it's actually the entrance to this new high-tech zone. So beyond this huge, classically inspired portal with these massive eagles and all kinds of references to like the fruits of the earth, a crest of the City of London. You go in and what do you see? You see stainless steel handrails, you see what look like ventilation pipes. It's almost like stepping from an airport through the boarding gantry onto an aeroplane. This is a point of embarking onto a magnificent journey of hope and optimism in 1986.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, it's an interesting building in the sort of trajectory, not only of Britain, the nation, London, the city of London, the city within the city, but also of high tech and of architecture. Because high tech kind of came from this like amazing techno utopian optimistic moment. All the graduates kind of were going through university in the 60s. They were inspired by people like Buckminster Fuller and Fry Otto, who were basically starting to save the planet. They were saying, you know, we need to make things lighter, we need to do more with less, we need to take care of spaceship Earth, was this very resonant phrase. And those guys inspired this whole generation of younger architects who went on to become the great sort of godfathers of this movement that we called high tech.
Certainly, they are like the gods of the architecture.
And they still are, right? You know, Norman Foster, Nicholas Grimshaw, Richard Rogers, who designed not only the Lloyds building, but the cheese crater, which you're going to have a look at in a moment. And their early projects were very light. They did a lot with very little. They were sort of spindly and very elegantly designed, using frugal amounts of materials to do kind of incredible structural feats and engineering challenges. And then this moment happens where high tech kind of beefs up, right? And this is kind of what we're looking at. This is the Lloyds of London moment where suddenly these guys who've been doing kind of little projects like massively bulk up, and all their architecture becomes muscular, uses loads of materials. It's still very expressive, still kind of amazing design.
This material massiveness of this monumental entrance, it just is the next progression.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of like, yeah, we're also going to build massive and huge and imposing, and of course that must have appealed to Lloyds of London, who are a financial behemoth and want to project an image of like courageousness, sure, and that's why they maybe commissioned contemporary architecture, but also of solidity and of reliability, and like they're not going anywhere, and using architecture to tell a kind of political story about their company.
So if this was a kind of coming of age for those high-tech architects, is this the swan song? This building here, Richard Rogers' Leadenhall Tower, the cheese grater, as it is nicknamed, this was under construction in 2010. Around about the same time the Lloyds building here was Grade 1 listed. So there's obviously a relationship between the earlier career architect or mid-career architect and then the more senior architect, who then has his own practice with various partners and various kind of amazing landmark work around the world, a winery, airports, train stations, really interesting housing projects.
Let's go and have a closer look at the cheese grater.
Okay. Yes. So I'm in some ways a fan of any kind of thing that you can see on the skyline, just because in some ways I know there's some controversy about London's skyline, but if you look now back at the skyline from the 90s, it just looks really thin and empty. So there's no going back. It's got a load of things in it, so let's just try and celebrate the ones that are there. Now this is the cheese grater, and I remember at the time I was an architectural journalist and we would get sort of press releases talking about how this was going to give this enormous public space to the city, the biggest new public space in the city, this city that's quite famous for its public spaces and pocket parks and churchyards and so on. Now on the right, this is actually a pretty cool bit of public space. There's some planting, there's some cool lighting installations, there's some trees, there's nothing above it. This genuinely feels like a good bit of public space. But on the left we have this new public square beneath the cheese grater. As you can see, there's some astroturf. I'm cycling on the astroturf. There's nothing really going on. I mean, okay, there's a COVID pandemic going on, but I've come here many times before the pandemic and there was nothing really going on back then either. Not to say that it isn't amazingly impressive. I mean, it feels like there's, I don't know, at least 5 stories above me. It feels really dramatic. I mean, it is impressive, but it's not necessarily the kind of super exciting public space that I would envisage. If I was going to create a public space for the city, I would possibly think about the functions and the people first rather than the form. But then again, this is a kind of the blossoming of the high-tech vision, so the form is important. And obviously Richard Rogers hasn't disappointed in this particular building. It has these enormous columns. I mean, look at this. This is bigger than anything the Victorians would have ever done. In fact, I don't think I can think of any building in London which has such expressive structural detailing. And what this is it's a kind of exoskeleton. So a lot of buildings, the inside of the building holds up the weight, but on this building, the outside of the building holds up the weight. So if I put my hand on this thing here, I'm channeling, these are weights. These are weighted things, and they connect here in a join, and that goes up all the way up to the top of the building. Mad.
Yeah, I think it's got a sort of tube structure, so that you put all of the forces that are going down the building into the perimeter, and this means you can free up the space in the middle for this, we were told, amazing public space. I guess the problem is that actually when it came to it, the public space we've ended up with as Londoners, it feels a little bit kind of anodyne, a little bit sterile. It's not particularly inviting. It doesn't even feel very public, It's sort of, it very much sort of speaks the language of the corporate tower that it's part of. It doesn't sort of take a break from that. It's got some bike locks in it.
It's some bike locks, so I can put the lock through the wheel here. I can lock my wheel to this and wave goodbye to my bicycle. Super.
But I think one of the interesting things about Richard Rogers is that you get the same motifs again and again. These giant air ducts here that you're standing next to are a kind of throwback to the Pompidou Center in Paris, which was his kind of big break with Renzo Piano, and that also had these huge air ducts, and you see them over and over again with Rogers buildings. It's sort of what started out as a kind of philosophy of how to make a building kind of reveal the workings of a building has ended up more like a style. So you can go to a catalogue and say, I want a Richard Rogers building, and be confident that that means kind of funky air ducts on the ground floor, and sure enough, they arrive.
I mean, the thing is, we're here right now at about 6 p.m. and normally a working day would be drawing to its close around about now. So the thousands of people working in this building would normally be coming out, decanting and going on their merry way to the train station and possibly via a restaurant or a bar. And as you can see, it's quite quiet, unless everybody's working really late in that building. I think that also hints at some of the kind of issues with a structure like this that was built in 2010, when Britain had just gone through a global financial crisis, but also there was a lot of optimism about a bounce back that would happen in around 2014, 2015. And that bounce back happened, and a lot of this stuff that was built, it did remarkably well. I think one of the main investors in this was a pension fund, and these are total, sensible, practical investments that did well. We had the Olympics, we had a property boom, we had a commercial boom, we had huge numbers of jobs being created in Britain, albeit many of them low-paid jobs. But then there is that kind of question about the nature of a building like this in our present situation. I would argue that this building is infinitely adaptable, and I would also argue that a building that gets smaller the higher you get up is probably better suited to residential use than commercial use, because with residential, the rooms at the top are the ones that sell for the very most because they have the best views, whereas as a commercial use, having an office at the top with very expensive but also very tiny is probably quite hard to find a tenant for.
I think one of the things that point raises is probably a point we're going to keep coming back to, is the relationship between the economy and what is going on in kind of the wider political and economic context of the country and the city, and the kind of architecture that you end up with as a result of that. You can kind of read the ups and downs of Britain's economy in the 20th century through the architecture that is produced by that kind of roller coaster. And now we're going to move on to another building that again sort of fits into that story, the Gherkin.
Absolutely. So the Leadenhall cheese grater was the first building on our tour which isn't listed. However, you could say, will this one ever be listed? I don't know. But the building we're going to next is a building that isn't listed, but it's a building I strongly think will one day be listed as an architectural achievement. And this is what is affectionately known as the Gherkin. And I think it's brilliant that we have a building called the Gherkin in a city where people actually don't really eat gherkins. Like, people are more into cucumbers, other kind of salad additions. But this is known as the Gherkin, or 30 St Mary Axe, or if you were living in London at the time, the Swiss Re building. It's extraordinary, and we're at the base of it, and the base of this building is somewhere most people never go, because this building is a building that's experienced from distances, and it's a building that's experienced very well from distances. You can see this on the motorway outside of London, you can see this on the Downs in Surrey, you can see it often if you're lucky enough from your flat or wherever you live in London. It's amazing, and you know exactly where it is. You know it's in the centre of London. But we're at the base of this tower. This is a building by Norman Foster. So it's the first Norman Foster building that we're going to see on this tour. It was built in the late 90s. And it was the first sort of big new addition to the City of London skyline. So it's an office building, it's curved, it's bulbous, it is a bit anthropomorphic, it has a kind of reference to the human body, but also to the natural world. It's made out of these tessellated triangles, obviously of flat glass, plate glass, which then looks as though it's curved because of the way they're elegantly put together. I would say that the ground floor experience isn't actually that bad. It's quite, in a way, it's like what you get on the tin. There's a lot of grey, there's some black, there's some white. It's a bit Norman Foster-esque. We're used to this kind of palette of colours and materials. But I think also when you're close to it, you sort of realise that the materials are nowhere near as exciting as the materials that you would expect to see when you see it from a distance. But once again, I would actually say that this really, to me, represents a new kind of British pragmatism. This is a building which is designed where the costs and the investments are all in the right places. It was designed to look great from a distance, and it does it. It doesn't really look that close up, but most people don't ever see it close up. So I think that this is an interesting progression from the Lloyds building that we just saw to a much more kind of fleet of foot building, which is really what you see in a lot of commercial offices now. It's certainly what you see in the new commercial offices next to the Lloyds building. It's sadly something you see in residential buildings as well, and that's not really acceptable. We're going to go around it. So I have a very special list of buildings that you can cycle around, and this is one of them. There's nothing really beats just cycling in a circle around a building. As you can see, it's totally pedestrian and cycle friendly here. It's a really chilled out environment. The City of London have created a very sort of special campus feel to these streets. This is the Eastern Cluster. This is a kind of insurance district. This is a major employment centre. You know, this is a bit like, along with downtown Manhattan, you know, this is one of the global financial centres of the world. It's really significant what's being cultivated and created here. Some sort of cultivation and gardening which you possibly think might need to take a bit of a radical new approach. Hopefully things can you know, bounce back in the way, in some of the kind of form that they were in before. But at the same time, this is a moment for big changes in all the way we live our lives. So you think there's possibly some scope for a bit of a rethink of the way these places work.
Something I find fascinating about the Gherkin specifically is that it's a very rare example of very contemporary, very like overtly contemporary architecture that is hugely popular. Everybody loves the Gherkin, you know.
Yes.
Your nan loves the Gherkin, the man in the street loves the Gherkin. And you can't really say that about most contemporary architecture.
No.
Generally, a lot of contemporary architecture has a sort of like, oh God, new modern rubbish, awful, get rid of it, go back to the old stuff, give me more classicism, give me more traditionalism. But the Gherkin like sort of flies in the face of that, and it's just enormously populist, I guess is the word. Like normal people love it, not just architects, not just kind of city boys, the everyman. And yeah, why? It's sort of a kind of interesting question, because Norman Foster clearly hit on something there, which even he struggles to kind of reproduce again and again. And it sort of makes me think, like, why do we have more of them? Why is there only one Gherkin? Why can we have a Gherkin in every city? Certainly, it does some sort of really good stuff from a kind of environmental point of view, and the way it draws air through it, the way that it's shaped, which means there's fewer gusts on the ground floor, which is a problem you often get with tall towers. Why do we have disgusting buildings like the walkie-talkie going up, when we could be having more sort of lovely things like the Gherkin? It's a pretty kind of lowbrow point in a way, but what do you think? Why do you think the Gherkin is sort of revered in a way that much contemporary architecture isn't?
I think it possibly betrays kind of like Britain's infatuation with innuendo. And if you think like the tradition of the Carry On films, it's you know, it's like a bit of a gag, but it's still a gag within a kind of framework of respectability. You know, it's like it's in its envelope, so you can have a chuckle around the dinner table and you can smile, but also there's a sense of familiarity. There's a sense that it's owned by the people who chuckle with this building, in a way that some other buildings which take themselves too seriously or don't really give back in the way they promise then become kind of impositions on the skyline. So this one invites you to have an opinion on it in quite a friendly and jolly way, and I think that is what makes it very endearing. And there's a kind of peculiar kind of British understatement in it, which not only brings everybody along who's here, but also everyone who joins the party as it's going. So I would say it is a really good example of inclusive architecture. Saying that as somebody who's never been in this building at all and knows not a single person who works in this building.
Well, that's exactly the thing. It's like you sort of feel warm and affectionate to it, even though you sort of know, like, the City of London does not really, you know, as a financial centre, a lot of the companies that operate here don't really have maybe Londoners' interests at heart, and yet we still have a kind of affectionate warmth towards this particular building, which that sort of transcends that kind of I don't know, animosity that we might normally feel as kind of non-city people.
And even though it was occupied by a Swiss reinsurance company, which is probably the most abstract thing. I mean, get your head around insurance, get your head around reinsurance. And from Switzerland, from an independent, another place. So you think some of the other banking institutions here in the city, Deutsche Bank or UBS, they don't really have a kind of big skyline presence. They're not exactly putting themselves out there. In international terms, say you've got JP Morgan over in Canary Wharf, but you don't really see that building unless you're over in Canary Wharf. So something with a big skyline presence. This is certainly unique, and it's something that some of the other buildings here, for example, where we're going to go next, 22 Bishopsgate, could possibly draw on.
Right. This is the power of good architecture to tell really compelling stories that draw people in.
And I think it captures that moment, because this was around about the turn of the new millennium. So the original building plan for this site was to be called the Millennium Tower, and effectively there was a kind of soul searching. Like what is the future? What is the past? It was a moment of a lot of opening up. In the 90s we had the Freedom of Information Act, which was a kind of an opportunity to open up some of the sort of secrecies of government. So then you also had a big chance to sort of open up some of the secrecies of banking, possibly through its architecture. So this was an attempt to really say what modern Britain was about, what its kind of gesture, or what the modern city of London was about, what its gesture would be, how it would be readable. Maybe this is something that inspired some youngsters to go into banking. The buildings around it are not very interesting at all. So there's like 80s granite clad polished stone type things. So I would say, in my opinion, St Mary Axe definitely one that's going to be listed in due course. So we're going to nip now over towards the newest skyscraper on the City of London's skyline. We're going to go right. So this is called 22 Bishopsgate, and it is an utter behemoth. You probably just know it as that big new one. So this is by PLP Architects. There were some endearing qualities in it, and it's just kind of like sheer solidness. It's like sheer kind of simplicity, in that it really doesn't try to hoodwink you, it doesn't try to beguile you or jolly you along. It just says, I'm a big building and I'm here to provide workspace. So that's all, totally valid in a way, if that's the limits of your imagination. But it's just completing. It represents something like a £1 billion investment. That's an awful lot of money. Think of the other things you could spend £1 billion on. It's a giant office building. It's quite tall. There's some quite cool bubblegum style artworks on the lobby. And it's absolutely gargantuan. And there appears to be quite a cool lobby at the ground floor. And then just floors and floors and floors and floors of offices above it. So from here, we're not going to dwell too long on 22 Bishopsgate, other than to simply explain that it's a very large new office building. We're going to go on Threadneedle Street, and Threadneedle Street is really one of the historic streets of London, City of London. It's where a lot of banks were based, and it takes us right into the centre of the historic city, where we're going to see some more historic architecture. So going from this kind of high-rise eastern cluster focused around insurance, and very much about making insurance tangible, to a kind of stone-clad, classically inspired low-rise district, possibly maybe reflecting the past centuries, an attempt to move people away from money as a physical thing embodied in gold to money as a kind of more intangible thing embodied in trust. So we see references in this architecture which are less about wowing on a kind of big national scale in terms of the skyline, but possibly more about wowing on a more intimate scale and persuading investors to put their cash in these enterprises. Yeah, let's do it. Okay. So, as cyclists, we're enjoying the very pleasant, quiet streets of the City of London. I can count 4 cars in front of me. That's probably testament to ongoing programs like the congestion charge, which have helped to get cars off the street. Nearly all the cars here are taxis, so not many people with private cars driving through the City of London. And obviously that kind of reflects the fact that it really is remarkably quite a sustainable transport zone. There are not many parking spaces in the city. People don't drive to the city, they cycle to the city. And that's an important part of the experience of the place, how people get around. So this is Threadneedle Street, and you can see we're in a very kind of intimate space, a very different feeling to where we were before. Stone edifices here. I would add stone edifices that have not been sandblasted. So this isn't really like the way Whitehall has been kind of re-glorified to become this sort of shining recreation of what the centre of London is. It retains the kind of grubbiness and griminess of the City of London of the 1980s. A place where offices would have been full of smoke and cantankerous personalities. So possibly this is like a heritage zone right down to the stains and the kind of fabric on the walls. So we're coming along, and you can see the distances in the city are tiny. So we're going just a few short steps really towards the Bank of England. And you can see as we come up to this structure, this imposing structure, which was designed by John Soane and later added to by Herbert Baker. There are these very solid walls on it, and this is because there are vaults of gold beneath it, 400,000 bars of gold. A beautiful sight for whoever's seen it, I'm sure. But itself, the building, again, this is the Bank of England, so this is what's supposed to sort of provide our economic certainty, what's supposed to finance the government, but also make sure that those sort of basics that keep an economy running for the greater good are maintained. And obviously that, as we know, they hasn't always gone quite according to plan. But I would also add, just like the Lloyds building, it's a remarkably opaque structure. It says nothing about the interior other than that you cannot see the interior. We're going to go up here and stop. This really is the kind of centrepiece of the city here. So on this corner, you obviously have the Bank of England, as I've just described, but next to it, you have the Grade 1 listed Mansion House. Now this building is from the 18th century. So it's very old. It's kind of older than it looks. It's an Italianate structure, but it's designed by British architect William Chambers. Originally it had a pavilion on the roof, so it went even higher than this, and that was called Noah's Ark, or like the mayor's nest. And it was like an additional layer where the mayor could hang out. And effectively, this is the home of the Lord Mayor of London. So this is a bit like Buckingham Palace, but Buckingham Palace for the City of London. And considering that it has that kind of glorious role, it's remarkably overlooked. Like, not many people know of Mansion House Station, but not many people know of Mansion House, the actual building. And certainly, I would hazard fewer people have actually been in it. And again, it's an interesting structure. I would say it doesn't really work when it's hemmed in quite so much like this. It looks like it should be in a kind of Arcadian field out in Berkshire or something, but it's surrounded on all sides, including behind the building as well. And again, it shows that kind of patina of London grime, which I respect very much. Grade 1 listed building. It's where the Lord Mayor's banquet happens. So this is where the Chancellor of the Exchequer has a white tie dinner. So this is like one of the few sort of images in British civic and political life where you see your political leaders wearing a white bow tie and looking quite ludicrous in a penguin suit, and he gives a speech in there. So in a way, this is like a deeply ceremonial and deeply symbolic space. But again, not necessarily telling that on the outside of the building, and certainly doesn't have that kind of purchase for the public to go in. But to the side of us here is the Royal Exchange. And so the Royal Exchange, this is by William Tite. It's another listed building. And this is the site of an earlier stock exchange. A stock exchange which then later was rebuilt in the form that we see, but there's been a stock exchange here for roughly 500 years. And obviously some of that dates back to the kind of formulation of City of London as a kind of empire, a centre of empire and trading, and some of the activities that went with that, including possibly the trading and the financing of the slave trade and the moving of slaves across the Atlantic. And recently a new walking tour, which was part of the Open House Festival, highlighted the references in the portico. The portico above this building contains people trading, and it contains commodities, and among the people is a black man, an African man, who is clearly there both as a person but would also appear to be as a commodity. Now that's a harrowing thing to think of for a building that was built in 1850 after the slave trade was abolished in Britain and in the Empire, British Empire. So it says a lot about it. But again, this is a listed building, and now it's a shopping centre, quite a glamorous shopping centre where you can go into a restaurant and so on. I think we should proceed to New Court quite carefully. So, as you can see, we are just a few spins of the cycle wheel from the Bank of England, from the Royal Exchange, and we're just going behind the Mansion House. You can see the kind of glorious scale of the Mansion House building here. And we're going into a little alleyway, and obviously, like, the City of London is an ancient thing, it's a medieval thing. There was a Fire of London, there was an epic plan to rebuild the City of London on a kind of rational scale and configuration, and none of that worked, and it was all just rebuilt in this kind of mad higgledy-piggledy medieval arrangement. Now we're coming here to one of my favourite spots in the City of London, and it's effectively what you have is the backside of Mansion House. You see it's just a brick building, it doesn't have that kind of grandeur at the front of the building. But also here to our left you can see New Court by OMA, and OMA is a Rotterdam-based architecture practice led by the journalist come architect Rem Koolhaas, who's considered a kind of leading cultural critic and voice of the early 21st century. So, you know, this is a kind of in sales terms, this is a kind of smashing together of high architectural theory and high architectural practice. In practical terms, it's an office building. It's the headquarters for the Rothschild Bank, which is a banking dynasty that's been based on this exact spot for 200 years. This spot chosen for its proximity to Mansion House and its proximity to the Bank of England. So clearly there's a kind of spatial relationship between these buildings and these institutions. What I really love about New Court is that actually this is the fourth New Court to be built on this site. So the banking dynasty periodically just said, let's just tear down this building and build a new one. So here's like a kind of ultimate faith in contemporary architecture, which is quite rare, and it's certainly quite rare in the 21st century when you compare it to the Lloyds building. So here you go, an example of a bank just saying, let's build a new building. The building itself, I think, is probably best described by its newness, or its attempt to be new. It is remarkably unremarkable from the outside, though. The only really interesting thing about it is its kind of proximity to the other buildings. But perhaps that was the intention.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, because I mean, I'm sorry that it's getting a little bit dark and we can't quite see the building so clearly, but I would wager that anyone watching, unless you're an architect, unless you're a sort of follower of either the Rothschild banking dynasty or of Rem Koolhaas and OMA, his practice, you probably don't know this building.
No.
And yet it is huge, and yet you can see it from all over the place.
Yes.
But it has a kind of neutrality that disappears into the background. It's not doing what the Gherkin is doing, of trying to become a skyline and draw people in. It's almost doing the exact opposite of trying to just be like, oh yeah, I'm here, I'm a nice bit of contemporary architecture, but you know what, if you don't remember me, good, I've kind of done my job. It's sort of like lurking on the skyline without actually drawing any attention to itself.
Yes.
And I just sort of, I wondered kind of why do you think the architect, the client, why did they want to do that with their building rather than be another Gherkin?
Well, I think that's really interesting. I think that if we think about it, this building was built in around about 2012. You could say that following the financial crash, there probably wasn't the most goodwill towards the banking industry. I think that was broad. It wasn't really targeted at any specific bank, but it was just generally. So I think that it probably wasn't the era for celebrating this form of organising an economy or organising a society. I think in a way it's unfortunate because I think there is probably sort of philanthropic potential to be expressed here. And I think that if you look, the Rothschild family have supported art and architecture, and these things have a bearing on wider public. So I think there's a kind of lost philanthropic gesture or lost kind of symbolic gesture that could have been made. I think personally, the architect is possibly less spectacular than we would like, and I think the built products of OMA are less interesting than I would like. And I think that possibly there's a sort of hedging of bets here, I would say. From an architect's perspective, there's a sort of, let's just build something modest that gets the job done and ticks all the boxes without exposing itself to too much risk. It doesn't really go wrong. It doesn't really have the potential to go wrong, but it doesn't have the potential to go right either. And I think that would be a very shrewd move by somebody who's described as the greatest architect of their time.
Doesn't have the potential to go right is possibly the most, I don't know, it's sort of like damning but also insightful analysis of the work of OMA. I'm sure you're going to get thousands of complaint letters from furious architecture students who've drunk the green Kool-Aid. But let's move on. Yes. Where are we going next?
So we're going to go from a building which would never have been shortlisted for the Sterling Prize, and which if the client likes tearing down buildings, they probably would hope that New Court never gets listed so that they can tear it down again in the future and build the 5th New Court on that building. We're going to the Bloomberg Headquarters, and this is a building which did win the Sterling Prize. This is one of the, effectively the greatest buildings that were built in Britain in the year 2018. It's an extraordinary office building. It's a headquarters for the Bloomberg Media Company, a media company which is famous for its financial services reporting, but also reporting on all kinds of really other interesting themes. So effectively, this is it's always like having the BBC right in the centre of the city. And it's actually, you can see a little bit more into it. It feels like it's more connected to the city than media companies typically are. So we've got you can see at this low level, you can see some offices, you can see these massive beautiful sandstone columns. You can see a building that is huge. So we're approaching a giant kind of chasm between the two buildings. Good evening. It's a beautiful building here. It's got bronze fins, it's got bars, it's got a reminder to practice social distancing, which we're doing, of course, on this social distance tour. We're in the Bloomberg Arcade. I mean, the arcade itself is possibly less exciting than the bit we were just in, as in there's these kind of dead facades here on the right. But on the left, we've got some cool restaurants, we've got people smiling, got some really beautiful looking benches. I mean, this is materiality, but it's actually a lot more. There is a kind of environmental story to it. And this is, we're talking about Bloomberg. This is a company owned by Michael Bloomberg. He was a mayor of New York. This is somebody who has achieved a lot singularly as a person in their life, which obviously you could say is a great achievement, but maybe you could say this is somebody who's commissioning a kind of legacy, a kind of statement to the city. Note also its proximity to New Court, to the Rothschild banking dynasty, to the Mansion House. This is a stone building in a way similar to the Mansion House, which is also a stone building. It seeks to be a good neighbour. The colours and the sort of tone of it and the sense of it, it fits in with other stuff rather than pushing against it. But it is huge. There's a great statement here.
So this is, of course, another Norman Foster building. Who,
yes.
We've already seen and discussed the Gherkin.
It's the second one of our tour.
And of course, Foster was another one of these, the kind of grandfathers of high-tech architecture, right? So the two Richard Rogers buildings, and now the two Norman Foster buildings, all kind of have some sort of genesis in this same moment, inspired by Buckminster Fuller and Fry Otto and these kind of early pioneers of high tech, and yet you can kind of see how far we've moved from this thought that you should do more with less. Like the Bloomberg building is, I think it's extraordinary in a number of ways. I think it has incredible attention to detail, right?
Yes.
Some of the kind of the way that they've done the ceilings is remarkable. The way that they've commissioned these giant artworks to sort of get round the need for security barriers, and so you have a big artwork that kind of does the job of a security barrier. There's some really good moves here, but it's also just massive, like huge pieces of stone, huge pieces of bronze. We're nowhere near the philosophy of more with less. This is definitely a more with more architecture.
Yes.
And we get more, but actually in a time of climate crisis,
Yes.
When we need to be conserving resources and construction being one of the most polluting industries on the planet.
Yes.
Can we really afford to do more with more? Maybe we need to reduce our consumption of materials.
And the building here before was equally massive. So this replaced, the reason you're able to build a huge building here is there was an absolutely huge building here before, and that building was brought down. So it does rather beg the question, it might have been a more progressive gesture to have somehow modified that existing building, to have somehow built on that rather than tearing it down and rebuilding it. Having been lucky enough to go inside the Bloomberg building, that sumptuousness goes all the way through it. And it's one of those things that I think about architecture. Really great architecture makes everybody feel good, okay? And when you're in there, you really feel good. It's like you're wearing an amazing coat or an amazing outfit that just, makes everyone look super cool. And I think some of that pervades into the spaces around it. When you look at it from the outside, it does make you feel a bit better. And I think that is possibly, in some ways, some of the best architecture in its expressive form can do. Something that just makes you smile. That's what the city should be full of, things that make you smile. I don't know if it's possible here to see the roof, the ceiling detail here, which looks like we're in a spaceship. And this is a kind of a special modular lighting grid that makes the suspended ceilings look really nice rather than really awful.
Yeah, we can't quite see it on the wide-angle lens, but if you think of a normal office building that has a kind of polystyrene grid of suspended panels, the reason that it has those panels is so that you can run all your cables and all your internet and all your ducts behind the polystyrene. Here they're still kind of, they need a suspended ceiling.
Yes.
But instead they've created this sort of extraordinary faceted texture of kind of petal-like forms that run across the ceiling, and they are the lighting, they are the ventilation, they are the screen that hides all of those messy cables. It's a bit of contemporary office architecture that is often completely overlooked is the ceiling condition.
Yes.
And of course all the people then have to work in that office.
Yes.
That sucks because you have this sort of horrible ceiling above your head.
Yeah.
So it's maybe a small detail when you think of how just gigantic this building is, but I was really impressed with the attention that they'd paid to the ceilings. And I think from the street, it's sort of magical. It kind of glitters. You have, as you look up at it, it's really quite sparkly, which I appreciate.
I like the way that there's a technological reference, and that lets us know about the accessibility of journalists. So one of the things I like about Bloomberg is at the end of their articles, they often have the email address of the journalist and the editor, so that you can email in stuff and updates and so on. And I think that technological reference shows something about the openness of journalism now, the fact that you can so easily contact journalists via Twitter or other mediums. But I think the physical structure also sadly says something about the defensiveness of journalism now, because sadly, journalists are often more and more under attack, certainly around the world, but also, nearer to home, like in Paris, there was an attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine. So it's sad in a way that journalism has to be be this kind of high security, sort of hived off endeavour, that it isn't as connected to the city in the way that it could be in the 21st century. But then again, it's optimistic that technology means that journalists can connect very well with people around the world. And so for me, I think that this building represents a kind of compromise between the kind of necessary solidity of running a mega media company, but also the kind of optimism that you can fuse new connections between people and the people who create the articles that they read. Shall we head on to our next spot? So I would also like to say that in my opinion, the Bloomberg's probably the most interesting building in the western part of the City of London. So going further that way, there isn't really much new, big, interesting architecture. So we're not going to look at new, big, interesting architecture now. We're going to look at a bit of old architecture. But old architecture that I would hazard is really, really cool and interesting. So we're going to go to the Guildhall. So we're following this street here. And once again, one of the beautiful things about the city is that everything's really close together. So just a few rotations of the bicycle wheel, and we've gone from the Bloomberg building up to the ancient centre of the City of London. So the Guildhall is effectively the town hall of the City of London. The City of London is a borough. It's a bit like a local borough like Lambeth or Southwark or Camden or Islington. But it's very different in that it's the only place where votes are not allocated by person, like by resident. They're allocated to businesses and other entities. So I could have a vote in the borough I live in. If I owned a business here, I could also have a vote here. So it's a kind of different, uniquely different kind of democracy that exists here in the City of London, a kind of democracy of commerce. So the Guildhall's been the centre of this for 500 years, and it's a really, really interesting building. It's possibly built on the site of, and also it may be older than 500, I might have got that wrong, but it's built on the site of an earlier sort of medieval Guildhall where people would have paid taxes or tithes to whoever was in charge of that. It's said that the Guildhall occupies the site of Brutus's palace, and Brutus of Troy is supposed to be the sort of legendary founder of Britain. Obviously Britain, Brutus. That's obviously a mythical association, but Brutus is said to have tied two giants to the gates of his palace, and you'll find even to this day within the Guildhall two wooden giants. They're called Gog and Magog. So there's a kind of a sort of nod and a giggle to this idea that this was Brutus's palace. Now we're in a square. I love this square. It is epic, it's beautiful, but also there's a really funny detail to it in that you can see, if you look very closely on the ground, there's a kind of ring, and the ring marks the site of an amphitheater. So there was a Roman amphitheater here, and it was the biggest, probably the biggest civic building in Roman Britain, and effectively this was a place of entertainment. So what was an amphitheater? You know, people, there would have been brutal battles between gladiators and wild animals. I mean, something quite scary to behold, but there would have been, you know, other kinds of entertainment. So this was a place of the people, and I'm here, okay, admittedly I'm here on a rather damp Thursday evening, but this is completely devoid of people. So to think that the Romans, if you would have told the Romans that in the future their amphitheater would be amazingly grand civic space, but an amazingly grand civic space with no people in it, they might have frowned. So I'd say I love this square, but I really feel like there's a sort of lost potential here. So what have we got? We've got the Guildhall on the left. It's a Grade 1 listed building. We've got the Guildhall Art Gallery. But what's really interesting is the west wing of the Guildhall over here. So this is an extension to the historic building by Giles Gilbert Scott, and it's from the 1950s. And this again is possibly one of the most kind of like overlooked extraordinary bits of brutalism in the country. It is insane. I mean, it looks like a launch pad for a rocket ship. I believe this is the robing chamber for the Lord Mayor, so before he goes on his ceremonial journey into the Guildhall, he can get himself ready. But it is, look at this, it looks like totally out of this world. It's beautiful, it's really fun, it would make a really cool house for someone, and it's you know, there is nothing else like this. No one builds stuff like this anymore, so I'm really happy that it got built here and that it exists somewhere. But I'm also really unhappy about this corner here. The only way in and out of the square, if you're a pedestrian, is through this weird kind of road access, which says beware pedestrians. And it seems to be designed for cars. I mean, this is like a bit of a missed opportunity to bring people in to this beautiful square. So you have to sort of go around the edge and nearly fall into a little pond and some shrubs. So that's an easy win for whoever looks after this. They could make something really a cool entrance to this square. But otherwise, it's a totally beautiful square and somewhere that I very much enjoy coming to. Okay, so here we are, we're on Wood Street. We've left the Guildhall behind us. This is the City of London's headquarters, a beautiful building, and we're going to go to possibly the most exciting thing that the City of London ever did, and it was building the Barbican. The Barbican is just completely different from anything else that you'll find anywhere else in Britain. It's a giant public housing estate. Well, it was publicly funded and publicly owned. It's not council housing in the way that we think of council housing, but then it is council housing in the fact that it's council owned and it is housing. It's an enormous scale. It's something that was completed in the 1970s but owes its genesis to the 1960s, and it's designed by the architects Chamberlain, Powell and Bon. Gosh, I forgot that wrong. Chamberlain, Powell and Bon. Okay, so you can see it's Thursday evening. But here we go. So we're going to go up into the Barbican. The Barbican, this is the ultimate homage to the City of London. This is the place where architects go to regenerate themselves. As you can see, access to the Barbican was not really designed for cyclists. It's got to be strong here. So we're hacking the Barbican. 2 cyclists on their way up to the sky level. The sky level was designed to segregate pedestrians from cars. They didn't really think where cyclists would fit into the matter. But here we are. We're cyclists and we're graduating from the car level to the pedestrian level. It's a great feeling, the sense of expectation. We obviously owe much appreciation to whoever put these escalators in. The escalators are a dream come true for cyclists such as ourselves. So we're about to enter the City of London's Barbican Estate. Okay.
Sorry, I lost the audio a bunch of times there as we were coming up the escalators because of the remarkably awkward position that we were in. But I think it's fine. Let's just continue. Press on.
Me okay on the audio?
I can hear you. Yeah. Hopefully it's all working.
So
live broadcasting, folks.
And I want to thank everybody who stayed with us through this live broadcast. Thursday evening. It's a bit damp outside. This is London in September, but this is the London we love. This is the City of London that all of London is named after. You know, this is really special. It wasn't always the fact that all of London was named after. In fact, it only dates back about 120, 140 years or so that effectively London as an entity is entirely named London. But here we are, so we're entering the Barbican Estate, and the Barbican Estate is a sumptuous experience. I mean, we've got these brick arches here, this kind of heavy materiality, concrete everywhere, beautiful brick tiles on the floor, these cute doors, this moody lighting. I mean, this is a kind of a place of reflection, a place of renewal. It's like a kind of cave, but it's open to the elements. We're moving from this dark tunnel to a valley. You know, this is an enormous showpiece. This is possibly, where we are now, one of the greatest urban compositions anywhere in the world. We're on a high level bridge. Beneath us is a terrace, is a waterfall, is a gardens, is a church, is an art centre, is a music college. is a kind of dream, a kind of total dream where everywhere you look are just echoes of the same design and architectural idea. The Barbican isn't a single place, it's like a kind of expansive mega structure that promises you everything. It promises you that it will never end. It is so big it could never end. Nobody could ever demolish the Barbican. Nobody could, although it has seen certain parts of it disappear and be rebuilt. We're going to go down to the lake, so I can hear musicians practicing in the music college. It's great that this kind of activity continues. So here we are. The best way to experience the Barbican, turns out, is by bicycle. We're going to go from the sky level down to the lakeside. We're coming towards the end of our cycle tour. We've taken you to what we think are the most visually interesting bits of architecture. This is a visually interesting bit of architecture which reflects the unique time it was built. This was a time of kind of optimism of the public sector. This was a time when most architects worked for councils, not for private practices. This is a time when the very best architecture was being built in places such as this. This was a time of extraordinary gestures. This was built to last forever, and it was built to appeal to the highest members of society. I mean, this was middle and upper class housing for bank workers and so on. It has an art centre, it has pubs, it has a school, it has nurseries, it has everything. It has dry cleaners, it has shoe repairs. It's the ultimate kind of expression of urban living. It suffered in that the City of London kind of lost control of it after Right to Buy. So it was then the case that people were able to buy their flats, and given the kind of clientele they were renting the flats to, they all bought their flats. So there's a very small number of them are still owned and rented out by the city. The city rents them out at a market rent, not a subsidised rent. It's a famous residence. George Best lived here. Daniel Craig Martin, the artist, lived here. It's a spot where an awful lot of architects probably live here. To be frank, it's where I'd quite like to live. It's in a great location. It's really smart. It's a really beautiful bit of architecture, and it's a listed building. And if you think that we've presented to you this evening a kind of clutch of what we think are really exciting, really visually compelling bits of architecture, places that a lot of us, because we're stuck at home, aren't able to get out and enjoy places like this. We're not able to sort of feel those raw experience, that kind of tactile nature, the smells, the sounds, the kind of intangible nature of being in great architecture. So we chose these sites because we really wanted to bring that to you at home. We really wanted to offer something so that everybody who's not had the chance to go out and won't have the chance to go out in the coming weeks and months can know that this is still here, waiting for you to return and embrace you into what is a very special part of the city, a very special part of the world, and a place that has enormous potential, that will continue to evolve and welcome new people and reinvent itself no matter what happens. Thank you. I've been Merlin Fulcher.
I'm Finn Harper. Yeah, that was a sort of a wacky experiment in live broadcast architectural criticism. Hopefully we've told you some interesting stories. I guess the story I cling to about the Barbican is it's sort of like the most ambitious housing estate ever made, or one of the most ambitious housing estates ever made, and it was commissioned by the City of London in this kind of heyday of heroic optimism. You know, in the 50s, after World War II, everything was rubbish. Rebuilding the country was a huge challenge, and they said, you know what, let's make a whole new bit of city, and we'll make sure there's everything that every citizen could imagine. You know, churches, pubs, art centres, lakes, parks, schools, whatever. We'll do it all. Concrete. And we'll employ one architect, and we'll give them a big budget and will make sure that they design everything down to the last detail. And okay, it's changed a lot. Like the whole of the City of London is buffeted around by economic forces, by political changes, but I think the Barbican sort of sticks out as an example of where like good architecture and good design sets up a kind of cultural and social infrastructure that endures kind of whatever forces crash against it from outside. And I personally would like to see a similar level of foresight and optimism and bravery to kind of grace this bit of the city again, because look at what it achieved back in the 50s.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think the city probably would right now say there's no regrets with the Barbican other than they could have built it bigger. They could have put more towers in here. That's the only thing that, it could have been more. That's it. Otherwise, there's nothing wrong with it.
Anyway, thank you for joining us, and if you've liked the show, please hit the thumb button, give us a like, give us a subscribe. It really helps us to take architectural discussions out to a bigger audience. But thank you for watching, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday. Hey, well done.